Hello, my name is Athene Donald, and my book, Not Just for the Boys, concerning the issues surrounding women in science, will shortly be published. In this series of podcasts, I will explore some of the key issues with experts from the field. With me today is Professor Diane Coyle. Trained as an economist, she is currently the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Author of numerous books about economics, she's very concerned by the lack of women in the profession. Diane, welcome. I suspect economics as a discipline is slightly different from physics in that it isn't necessarily a subject children make a decision about at school, for instance, at A-level. What are the typical percentages of women studying economics at university? One study I saw from Australia said numbers were actually falling. How bad is it?
Well, the numbers of students studying economics at undergraduate level has been very strong, particularly since the financial crisis. That brought about an increase because concerned young people wanted to understand what was going on in the world. But that meant that the proportion of women did decline a bit. It obviously varies between countries, but at undergraduate level, it's not too bad. It's getting on for half. And then the pipeline leaks a lot at every successive stage. And so if you look at graduate study, then it drops much further. By the time you get to professorships, it's down to 14%, and among senior professors, it's probably 8% or so in the UK. So, and those figures haven't improved over time. If anything, they've been going down. Similar story in the United States, figures very similar. And again, there was some progress at one time in American universities, but that seems to have ground to a halt, and if anything, to be going into decline now. So economics, along with some of the natural sciences, philosophy, computer science, among the group of subjects which seem to be no-go areas for girls and women.
I mean, the numbers you're quoting for female professors is even worse than physics. So what are the explanations put forward for economics that this happens?
Nobody's got a definitive causal explanation for why this should be so. And one possibility is that women and girls, one suggestion is that women and girls put off by the mathematical nature of economics. They don't want to go into it in the first place. This is clearly nonsense, given that in the UK, girls do better at maths at A-level than boys do. So we can do maths, we can do the numbers. I think it's more to do with what young women discover to be the character of the subject, which has a kind of self-fulfilling nature to it. So economists study certain things in certain ways, and they don't address lots of questions that concerned young people might think were of interest, and particularly concerned young women. So there has been a kind of career path from an undergraduate degree in economics into a job in the city. And so it's all about money. And actually economics is hardly about money at all. But that's the perception among people who don't go to later stages in their career. So that would explain that level, that stage. Then the question is, with the ones who do stick with economics, why does that pipeline then shrink so rapidly? What is it about career structures and what makes people succeed in academic jobs in economics that means that women drop out as quickly as they do? And there, again, I don't think people have a definitive answer. Some of the issues are common to all academic subjects. Career structures for early career researchers are terrible if you want to start a family. You get some allowance for maternity leave in terms of how long you've got to do the things that get you promoted, but not enough. So, but those are common to all subjects. What is it about economics and some of the other disciplines we've been talking about? And I think it's to do with the kind of cognitive style. It's what subjects do you think are interesting to ask? And if you've got a very narrow population, that's going to be a narrow subset of questions. And then it's partly about what kind of style do you reward? What do people applaud among their colleagues? And it's something about being able to demonstrate technical brilliance, doing a certain kind of narrow research in a particularly mathematical showy way, or it's quite a narrow perspective on what makes good economics. So that for me has become what I think is one of the major barriers.
I mean, it's clearly different from a subject like physics or indeed computing, because there, certainly in this country, the numbers are never high. So the numbers doing physics A-level are about 20 or 25% girls. means they never really start on the pipeline. And you're saying that at undergraduate level, it's about 50-50. So it's a different problem. But what you're describing sounds a bit more like I've heard said about philosophy, where the Socratic style of argument is favoured, and it just doesn't appeal to a lot of people, and largely women, I think. So there is a stylistic argument, which I suspect is less apparent in physics, actually. The numbers fall off probably less in physics. They just start very low.
There are obviously some other issues as well, aren't there? I mean, if you're
Yes.
a very male-dominated discipline, where are the role models? Where do young women see themselves in the future? So that will be common to all of them.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But you're also saying the kinds of topics that are studied. And I guess this is why it matters that there aren't more women in the subject, because the kinds of questions that might be of interest to them are just not seen as appropriate, if you like. And it isn't just about hard numbers or macroeconomics. Do you find more women in behavioural economics, for instance?
There are certainly skews among the different subfields. So macroeconomics and theory are very, very male-dominated. Labour economics, development, much less so. So there's definitely that kind of skew. And the more you get towards, quotes, real-world problems, the higher the proportion of women will be. But it really matters. You know, economics is a social science, and people don't know what they don't know.
Yes.
And so if you've got a very narrow social base to exaggerate, it's white, male, posh, then there are whole swathes of experience they don't have. So they don't know all the kinds of questions that they should be asking in the research. And I guess this is one thing that kind of worries me about the future of the subject. If it's becoming increasingly remote from things that matter to normal people, it's becoming a less good social science. And you do see women economists, I think, more. I've got no hard data on this, but I think turning up in other kinds of departments. So I, for example, I'm not in an economics department.
Yes.
I'm a public policy person now.
Yes. And presumably you would also argue that it's very bad, not just in an academic sense, but in a social sense, because, as you said earlier, everything gets tied back to the financial aspect instead of what is life really like and how could we improve it, feeding in some economic arguments. And that includes biodiversity and the value of nature, which I know is something else you are passionate about.
Absolutely. When I was at the University of Manchester previously, we did some outreach with local schools to girls and local sixth forms to ask them what did they think in economics involved and tell them what kind of work we did. And so the word clouds that got produced from that were money. It's all about money. And actually, my work thinks about the value of nature, about what's the value of arts and culture. Can we start to think about how, as an economy, we treat those assets and what they do for people's well-being, so broader well-being questions. That's all economics too, because it's all about the choices that people make and the trade-offs that people make in allocating time and other scarce resources, which is what it's fundamentally all about.
And you think it's getting worse, not better, from what you've said?
So that's an interesting question. The numbers haven't been improving at all. The good news is that the professional associations, the Royal Economic Society here, the American Economic Association, are very concerned about it now and have women's committees, initiatives to diversify the subject, complaints procedures, because one of the cultural aspects is there's a style of engagement in discussing people's research. Economics seminars can be brutal places. And I would often go to them and see a row of senior people sitting at the front, immediately arguing before the poor presenter has got off the first slide, challenging on things that they're clearly going to get to by the third slide. And it's a ridiculous posturing kind of culture. And the female graduate students will be sitting quietly in the back row taking notes. Anybody not confident and probably male and probably privileged is not going to find that kind of culture very comfortable. So there's all of that aspect of it as well.
So again, the differences with physics in this country, the Institute of Physics has done a lot of work with interventions in schools because early years are seen as the problem rather than the culture thereafter. I mean, there are problems, and in other sciences, if I broaden beyond physics, subjects that have field trips, for instance, are full of aggressive sexual harassment and things like that. But you're implying the problems are later, and therefore the nature of the interventions would be later. So if something like the Royal Economic Society, if I've got the name right, or I saw that the Sloan Foundation, I think, was trying to put some money up. What kinds of interventions are they looking to do to try and overcome these problems?
In some American universities, there have also been issues about bullying and sexual harassment. So in the past few months, there have been a number of cases raised and a vigorous debate in the profession, including naming some names, some senior male figures who were stand accused of this kind of behaviour. The funding is to try to think about what sorts of interventions would change that culture, and is asking for proposals. And it's not an easy fix, is it? Because people appoint people in their own image who do their kind of research, and you very quickly learn to internalize, you get socialized into that kind of culture if you want to get on. So people either drop out or they go along with it. So I think those kinds of cultural habits are really hard to change.
And possibly speaking out of turn, but I know when I worked with the European Research Council, attending one of the grant decision-making panels in economics, it was staggering how narrow their focus was. And if you weren't in the right areas, if you weren't publishing in the top 5 journals, you weren't going to make much headway. So funders could have a key role to play in saying, we are not going to tolerate this cozy white boys club. And arrogance is not going to get you anywhere, or not as far as you might think it might. Is there any move in that direction?
I don't think funders are a real problem, although because it's a system problem, they're going to get economists to review economics applications for obvious reasons. And there is a very deep embedded belief that only publications that get into the top 5 are the good ones. So mainstream economic departments are always going to hire on that basis. And I think reviewers look for those kinds of publications to check out people's CVs. But funders on the whole are open to broad interdisciplinary questions now. And once you're kind of established, I don't think raising the funding to do that sort of work is a difficult one. But the top 5 journals problem, incredibly narrow. They've got a certain style and a certain kind of question they think is important. So, for example, they've had very little on environmental economics for decades. There's a lot of great environmental economic research, but it doesn't get into the top 5, and therefore it doesn't get into the mainstream debate. And 5 Nobel laureates have come together to argue for a broader approach to assessing worth in economic publishing, and it's not had any impact so far. So I don't know how you break that one.
That requires people not to vote for their clones, doesn't it? I mean, there's DORA, so the Declaration on, I can't remember what it stands for, but essentially do not use impact factors. Would that have any impact if economists actually stuck to that?
Well, I can't imagine them sticking to it.
That's pretty damning.
What's interesting is really about the intellectual character of the subject. So 2 things shaped economics the way it is today. One was the so-called marginal revolution at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, when economists discovered that they could use differential calculus to think about the impact of small changes in a more rigorous analytical way. So it's a powerful tool, but it concentrates you on small problems. You can only apply this to small changes. So it increasingly diverted people's attention away from big problems like the nature of capitalism. And then the other was in the 1930s and the impact of positivism, which said you can separate knowledge into stuff that we know that's objective and empirical, and that's what science does, and stuff that's airy-fairy metaphysics. And we economists are going to stick to the stuff that's scientific. And so, although all of public policy economics involves value judgments and trade-offs between different groups of people, there's this deep-seated belief that economics is objective. So in the way that you can measure the height of a mountain or the temperature of something, you can measure GDP, which is a nonsense because it's an idea, it's an intellectual construct. You can measure it any way you want to. And I'm trying to make people measure it in a completely different way.
I have read your book, yes.
So these, this kind of intellectual deformation And there is evidence, I think, that that's starting to shift. Certainly, many economists are doing more interesting kinds of works and asking bigger kinds of questions. And there's an interest now in those bigger questions, partly because the world is throwing some really big problems at us to think about.
Yes, I mean, the Stern report, did that not change attitudes at all?
Slowly. It wasn't a rapid impact, but I think it's a slow burn impact. And
I mean, it was an economist trying to put a real value on an incredibly complicated system.
Yeah. And there are different views about how you do environmental economics. Bill Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize a few years ago, developed integrated assessment models, which many environmental economists would challenge as being a sensible way to think about climate, because they imply that we can afford not to do much now about climate change because we'll be so much richer and more easily able to afford it in the future. And so there's an assumption about the kind of dynamics involved, which many people think is incorrect. So that's a bit of a tangent. It's a long-winded way of saying that has become a really central debate in economics now. We just need to get it into the classroom, which is something else I've been involved in trying to do, and into the top 5. Let's make it mainstream.
And when you say the classroom, you don't just mean schools, you mean university courses, presumably. Yes. I mean, it's, if you are getting the young women to start the courses and they're then dropping out, you presumably want to change the topics and the culture simultaneously.
Yes, and the approach. I was involved early in an initiative called CORE. Again, I forgot what the acronym stands for. It's something open resources in economics, free online textbook called The Economy. It's not about economics, it's about the economy. What are the problems we're trying to address? And let's think about power relations in the workplace, income distribution, the environment, the process of innovation. Let's think about all of those things that make this such a fantastic, interesting, important subject. Let's also talk about the intellectual history of our subject and how people have thought about these things over time. So that resource is there, it's gaining traction. So to go back to your question about are things changing, I think they are changing. But, you know, we're going to have to keep on pushing.
And if there aren't many women, who's going to do the pushing?
A lot of the men will do the pushing.
There are plenty of men in that camp too.
Yeah, we have many allies, but system change and institutional change happens slowly at first, and then one day it will happen quickly, and we'll look back and wonder why it took so long. That's the hope, anyway.
Yes. And have you found, speaking personally, a lot of pushback on the kind of economics you do?
A mix. So there are definitely chaps in economics who think that what I do isn't serious because I don't use the, you know, topology or set theory that they think is interesting, and I don't get published in the top 5. I range much more widely. I do interdisciplinary work. On the other hand, a lot of economists are interested, so I get invited to talk all the time in economics departments and give lectures. So it's schizophrenic.
And what enabled you to survive?
I think not having been an academic long term.
So you went into the civil service first, didn't you?
I started in the civil service. I had a long detour into journalism. Then I did a number of public service roles, and then I came into academia quite late. It's really much harder to challenge the structures if you have to work your way up through them from the bottom.
So you think academia is worse than any other place where an economist might work?
It's clearly worse than the government economic service in terms of numbers. And that partly reflects the huge effort the government employer, as an employer of economists, has made to create career structures, flexible structures, give people breaks. They started an apprenticeship scheme, which has really diversified the intake. So they've done a fantastic job of diversifying in that sector of economics employment.
I mean, I certainly feel, and not all my academic colleagues would agree, but I feel that if you are trained as a scientist, physicist, chemist, whatever, and you then decide to go into public policy, civil service, industry, journalism, I feel all those you are using your scientific training, and it is very valuable. So in one sense, if the women get trained in economics and then go into a path more like yours and just stay in academia, if that should not be seen as a failure or bad for the sort of wider society. But on the other hand, it sounds like there is still something of a stranglehold in economics on what is seen as economics, and therefore what you teach, and therefore how women entering it perceive it.
There is a bit, but I would agree with you that once an economist, always an economist. You're trained in a certain way of thinking, and you can apply it to so much of everyday life that I think it's almost a vocation. And I've always described myself as an economist when people ask me what I do, rather than I'm a consultant or I'm a journalist. So I'd agree with that. I do think the problem is academic economics, and also the shouty kind of economics, if you understand what I mean, the kind of people talking about financial markets or the macroeconomy who have completely Punch and Judy versions of truth when they're interviewed on the media, which is really unhelpful for the discipline. Yes,
I would certainly agree with that. And as a non-economist, I look at it and think that's very unattractive, and do I believe either side? So it doesn't necessarily advance anything. But if I go back to the civil service, and I'm showing my prejudices now, it always struck me when I worked, for instance, with DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sports, there were loads of economists and one scientist. And so the economists were called the scientists, and I felt, no, we need more scientists. This is an area. And it was exactly how do you evaluate incredibly complicated things? But the scientist viewpoint would not have been the same as the economists necessarily. So do lots of economists go into the civil service?
It is one of the main hiring streams, and there's broader hiring from the social sciences. As far as I know, much less from engineering and the natural sciences, yes. Which seems like a mistake.
Yes.
I'm absolutely convinced that any of the questions I'm interested in, how do you regulate digital markets and ensure there's competition or innovation, I couldn't do that without talking to computer scientists and telecoms engineers. You can't tackle problems like that unless you've got those different approaches involved.
Some of the joy is talking to people from very different disciplines. Yes. If you stick within your own discipline, it can get very narrow and, well, unexciting in my view. And do you think women thrive? I mean, it is sometimes said, I really don't know the evidence about this, that women like interdisciplinary working, but interdisciplinary working isn't particularly favoured by some structures, including funders, and therefore the women are disadvantaged. Do you think in economics it's true that women are more likely to be interdisciplinary?
So, good question. I think a lot of bright young people are kind of interested in big problems and would recognise that you need different bodies of knowledge to address them. But interdisciplinary work, as you will know, is really, it requires a lot of patience because you're learning somebody else's language. And you have to be able to listen to them, what I've heard called communicating with your ears, and think about what they mean. To give us a silly example, I was at a dinner last night where somebody said they were an information engineer. And to him, it meant something particular about information theory and signaling and signal noise ratios and all that kind of stuff. And I heard that as somebody who'd been a journalist previously as, oh, that's, making people think what you want them to think. It's that kind of information engineering. So it's an example of how the same words can mean completely different things when you're coming from different directions. So maybe, again, I know no evidence about this, but maybe there's something about the patience and empathy you need to be able to have those conversations to do interdisciplinary work that does favour women doing it.
That's slightly damning, stereotyping men as impatient and unempathetic.
Just why we're brought up emphasising my lack of evidence. It's just a supposition. I don't know,
but I mean, I think that comes back to what I said at the beginning. Didn't seem so important in economics, the early years, because I think boys and girls are brought up differently by society, not necessarily by individual parents, but by society. They get different messages. The boy, the man has to go out and do, and the woman should nurture and be empathetic. And it is a sad fact that our society still reflects that at every stage. And so maybe if you're right that there are more women in some of those areas because they are patient, they've been trained to be patient by everything about them, from the media, the schooling, the whatever.
Maybe there's some truth in the old stereotype that women will stop to ask for directions and men will drive in the wrong direction for half an hour before admitting they're wrong.
I couldn't possibly comment on that. But yes, I fear we are conditioned from our early years. And I don't know, what would you like to see done in schools to improve the situation?
I think that's a tough question. I don't know what I'd like to see done in schools. I think role models matter, but that puts a lot of burden on the women who are willing to go out and do that. I do a lot of public engagement. I run a festival of economics each year in Bristol. We get lots of people who are normal folks coming along to listen to the really wide range of subjects that we talk about. I suspect it just requires a lot of different things to change before we can get the big picture to change.
And
what would you like to see done in schools?
Well, I think in physics it's possibly easier because there is evidence of the way the teachers interact with boys and girls in the classroom. There is evidence about the way the implicit messaging. I mean, to give you a specific example, a biologist, in fact, in Cambridge said to me about her daughter that, you know, she was told at, I don't know, age 10 or something, she did maths like a boy. Now, I don't even know what that means, but as long as that kind of messaging comes across, I think there are problems. And that statement, I mean, given economics is a very quantitative, you know, you do need maths. That kind of message will also be detrimental, and it may not be manifest straight away. I mean, one of the things I haven't mentioned to you, but which I found very striking, there was a paper that came out about 7 years ago now, looking at what was deemed brilliance, you know, how people perceive different subjects versus the percentage of women in those subjects, I think at PhD level. On economics, philosophy, computing, you've mentioned all those, physics, they are perceived by the average member of the public as requiring brilliance. That message must set in incredibly young, that these are subjects that you have to be brilliant, and by and large girls aren't brilliant. That just seems to be the subliminal message.
Yes, well, economics isn't done usually before sixth form, so
No.
That early conditioning probably doesn't play as big a role.
But the conditioning about you have to be brilliant and girls aren't brilliant will then feed into the realization that perhaps you need to be brilliant to do economics. And the way you've described economics being shouty and, you know, people standing up and arguing and things may imply that to someone seeing it for the first time. And
that sort of level of confidence can easily be mistaken for brilliance. It might not be warranted, but it looks like it's.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And do you see yourself as a role model?
I've never thought about it very much, but I suspect so.
Other people see you as that, whether you want to be or not.
Yeah. Yes. So for women studying economics in this university and others, I'm sure they would know, because I'm, you know, on the media a lot, would know about me. So yes, I guess is the answer to that.
Yes, they don't all come knocking at your door and asking. Of course, you're not in an economics department, so it's slightly harder to come and knock on your door. Maybe that's helpful for you. It gives you more time to work, because, as you say, it is a burden. If you are identified in that way, it becomes time-consuming. However willing one might be wanted to do it for one individual, it can become very time-consuming.
And you must have had the experience of getting a late invitation to be on a panel and figuring out that they've realised they've got a mantle and they better do something about it.
Yes, it's not very flattering, is it?
Not at all, no.
No. Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting to try and draw these, you know, where there are similarities and where there aren't, because we both work in subjects that are very male-dominated.
And fixing it is an important task. So
yep, there's a long way to go.
Indeed.
So thank you very much.